Welcome to Heartline Stories. Today's tale is about Connor, a billionaire whose life seems perfect but hides a lonely heart. One rainy day, a simple visit to an animal shelter begins to change everything. What draws him to the shelter and who will leave an unforgettable mark on his life? Friendship, hope, and choices. This story will keep you wondering what truly matters most. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let the magic of Heartline Stories touch your heart. Once there was a man named Connor. Connor was one of the richest people in America. He owned tall buildings, fast cars, and even a private jet. But Connor's heart felt as empty as his huge mansion. Money could buy him everything except someone who truly cared about him. One rainy day, Connor drove past a small animal shelter. He noticed a sign that said, "Help us save lives." For some reason, he stopped his car. Maybe it was the rain, or maybe it was the thought of doing something different for once. Connor stepped inside the shelter. The shelter was small and smelled of wet dogs and old rugs. A friendly woman named Rachel greeted him. Rachel wore glasses and had hair tied in a messy bun. She didn't know Connor was famous. To her, he was just a man who had wandered in. "What brings you here today?" Rachel asked, smiling. Connor paused. He didn't really have an answer. I, I just wanted to look around." Rachel nodded and showed him around. There were dogs wagging their tails and cats curled up in boxes. One dog in particular caught Connor's eye. It was a big dog with one floppy ear and the saddest eyes he had ever seen. Its name was Max. "Max has been here for months," Rachel explained. "He's a sweetheart, but nobody seems to want him." Connor knelt down and looked into Max's eyes. For the first time, he felt something warm in his heart. "I'll take him," Connor said, surprising himself. Rachel's face lit up. "That's wonderful. You're going to love him." Connor signed the adoption papers and took Max home. At first, Max was shy and nervous, but soon he began to follow Connor everywhere, around the big empty mansion, during long walks in the park, and even when Connor worked on a computer. Max made the house feel a little less lonely. Days turned into weeks, and Connor started visiting the shelter more often. He brought donations, toys for the animals, and even food. Rachel was always there, working hard to care for every animal. She smiled every time she saw Connor and Max walk in. Little by little, Connor and Rachel started talking more. She told him funny stories about the animals, and he shared tales of his life before becoming rich. They laughed a lot, and soon Connor realized something strange. He felt happier at the shelter than he did in his mansion. One day, Connor found himself asking Rachel a question. "Would you like to have dinner with me sometime?" Rachel hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "I'd like that." Connor couldn't hide his excitement as he picked Rachel up for their dinner date. He had chosen a cozy little Italian restaurant downtown. It wasn't too fancy, but it had a warm, welcoming vibe, just like Rachel herself. Max stayed at home for the night, but not before Connor promised to bring him back some leftovers. As they sat at a table lit by soft candlelight, Connor felt nervous. He wasn't used to talking to someone like Rachel, someone who didn't care about his money or his fame. But as the evening went on, they found themselves laughing and sharing stories, just like they always did at the shelter. Rachel told Connor about her childhood, how she had always loved animals and dreamed of starting her own shelter one day. "It's hard work, but it's worth it," she said. "Seeing the animals find their forever homes makes everything better." Connor listened intently, a strange warmth filling his chest. He shared stories about growing up, about the time he sold lemonade as a kid, dreaming of one day becoming successful. But somewhere along the way, he admitted, I think I forgot what really matters. Rachel looked at him with kind eyes. It's never too late to figure it out, she said softly. The night ended with Connor walking Rachel back to her car. Before she left, Rachel turned to him and said, I had a great time tonight. Me too, Connor replied, and for the first time in a long while, he genuinely meant it. Over the next few weeks, Connor continued spending time at the shelter. He and Rachel grew closer, and so did Max and the other animals. Connor even started helping out with some of the shelter work, surprising himself with how much he enjoyed it. But Connor's old life wasn't ready to let him go. One afternoon, while he was at the shelter helping Rachel clean out the kennels, his phone buzzed loudly. It was an important business call, a deal worth millions of dollars. Connor frowned, torn between answering the call and staying to help Rachel. I can finish up here, Rachel said, noticing his hesitation. Go ahead. It sounds important. Connor nodded and stepped outside to take the call. As he spoke, surrounded by the noise of traffic and the weight of his old responsibilities, he realized something. No amount of money could replace the happiness he felt at the shelter, with Rachel and Max. That night, as he sat alone in his mansion, Connor made a decision. It was time to change his life, to find a balance between his success and the things that truly made him happy. The very next morning, Connor sat at the breakfast table, staring at his untouched cup of coffee. His mind was swirling with thoughts. He realized it wasn't enough to simply visit the shelter and help out here and there. He wanted to do more, something big that could truly make a difference. Max patted over and nudged Connor's hand with his nose, as if to say, You've got this. Connor smiled and ruffled Max's ears. That was it. He had an idea. Later that day, Connor returned to the shelter. Rachel was outside fixing a wobbly fence post, her hands smudged with dirt. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. Back so soon? She teased. Connor nodded, his heart beating a little faster than usual. Rachel, I've been thinking. I want to help the shelter in a bigger way. What if we expanded it, built better facilities, gave the animals more space, and reached out to more people? Rachel's eyes widened in surprise. Connor, that's an amazing idea, but it sounds really expensive. We're barely scraping by as it is. Connor grinned. Let me worry about the money. You've been doing so much with so little. Imagine what you could do with the right resources. Rachel's expression softened, and for a moment, Connor thought he saw tears in her eyes. Connor, I don't know what to say. This could change everything. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking about plans. Rachel shared her vision for the shelter, an adoption center, a play area for the animals, and even a small clinic for medical care. Connor jotted down every detail, determined to make it all happen. As the days turned into weeks, the shelter began to transform. Construction crews arrived, building new kennels and play areas. Volunteers came to help, inspired by Connor's generosity. The community rallied around the shelter, donating supplies and spreading the word. Through it all, Connor and Rachel grew closer. They spent long hours working together, sharing meals, and even sneaking moments to play with Max and the other animals. Connor felt happier than he ever had, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that his old life might try to pull him back. One evening, as the sun set over the nearly finished shelter, Connor and Rachel sat on the steps, watching Max chase a ball in the yard. Rachel turned to him and said, Connor, you've done so much for this place, but are you happy? Connor looked at her, surprised. I don't think I've ever been happier, he admitted, but I keep wondering, can I really leave my old life behind? The deals, the meetings, the pressure. It's all I've ever known. Rachel placed a hand on his arm. You don't have to choose, Connor. You can find a balance. The shelter will always be here, and so will I, if you want. Connor's heart swelled at her words, but before he could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. It was a call from his business partner, marked urgent. Connor stared at his buzzing phone, the word urgent flashing on the screen. He hesitated, his mind torn between answering the call and staying in the peaceful moment he had with Rachel. Finally, he sighed and picked up the phone. Connor, it's about the merger. We've hit a snag and we need you to come in tomorrow, his business partner said, his voice tense. Connor frowned. He had promised Rachel and the shelter volunteers that he would help with the grand opening tomorrow. It wasn't just any day. The new shelter was ready to welcome its first visitors and hopefully find homes for many of the animals. I'll think about it, Connor said, ending the call quickly. He didn't want to say yes, but the pressure weighed heavy on him. Rachel noticed his troubled expression and gave him a soft smile. Is everything okay? She asked. Connor nodded, trying to shake off the doubt creeping into his mind. It's just work stuff, but I don't want to let anyone down, not at the shelter or at my company. Rachel placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. Connor, you've done so much for the shelter already. Whatever you decide, just know that everyone appreciates you. The night passed slowly, with Connor caught in a storm of thoughts. He couldn't help but think about how much his life had changed since meeting Rachel and adopting Max. For once, his happiness wasn't tied to business deals or bank accounts. It was tied to the shelter, to Rachel, to Max, and to the lives they were changing together. The next morning, Connor walked into the shelter early. The volunteers were bustling around, setting up decorations and organizing adoption paperwork for the big event. Rachel greeted him with a cheerful wave and Max trotted over, wagging his tail. Ready for the big day? Rachel asked. Connor nodded, though his mind was still clouded by the decision he had to make. As the shelter filled with visitors, Connor watched families and individuals meet the animals, their faces lighting up with joy. He saw Rachel guiding them, her kindness shining through, and Max happily mingling with everyone. Just as Connor thought he had found peace, his phone buzzed again. Another urgent call from his business partner. He glanced at Rachel, who was helping a young girl choose a puppy, and sighed. He couldn't ignore the call forever. Connor stared at his phone, the buzzing seeming louder than it actually was. He took a deep breath, stepped away from the crowd at the shelter, and finally answered. Connor, where have you been? The board is furious. You need to fix this, now, his business partner barked on the other end of the line. Connor clenched his fist. For years, this kind of call had been routine, a part of his daily life. But now, standing on the edge of a new chapter with the shelter and Rachel, it felt like an anchor trying to drag him backward. I can't come in today, Connor said firmly, surprising himself. I have something important here. There was a long pause on the other end. Connor, this deal is important. You're risking everything. I've made plenty of deals, Connor replied, his voice steady. But this is the first time I've felt like I'm doing something that really matters. His business partner scoffed. You'll regret this. The call ended abruptly, leaving Connor alone with his thoughts. He stared at the phone, half expecting it to ring again, but it didn't. For the first time, he felt a sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. When Connor returned to the main area of the shelter, Rachel was by the adoption desk, helping a family fill out paperwork. She glanced up and smiled at him, the kind of smile that made everything else fade away. The day went on, and the grand opening was a huge success. Families left with new furry companions, and the shelter was filled with laughter and excitement. Connor felt a warmth in his chest as he watched Rachel and Max playing with a group of children in the yard. Later that evening, as the sun set and the visitors trickled out, Rachel approached Connor. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. Today was perfect." Connor smiled, but his mind was still clouded by his earlier call. "There's something I need to tell you," he began, but before he could finish, Max barked excitedly and bolted toward the gate. A man in a sharp suit stood at the entrance, his expression stern. Connor's heart sank. It was one of his senior executives. "Connor," the man said, "we need to talk. Now." Connor felt his heart race as the executive stepped forward, his stern expression cutting through the peaceful evening. Rachel watched curiously, sensing the tension but staying quiet. "Connor," the man said, "your absence is affecting the company. We need you to make a decision, commit fully or walk away." Connor glanced at Rachel, who stood by his side, and then down at Max, who wagged his tail as if encouraging him to choose wisely. He thought about all the deals he'd made, all the late nights and empty celebrations, and how none of it had ever brought him the joy he felt now. Taking a deep breath, Connor faced the executive. "I've already made my decision," he said firmly. "My life isn't about deals anymore. It's about making a real difference, starting here, with the shelter." The executive stared at him, stunned. "You're giving up billions for this?" Connor smiled, his voice steady. "I'm not giving up anything. I'm gaining everything." As the executive left, shaking his head, Connor turned to Rachel. Her eyes were wide with surprise, but she smiled warmly. "You did it," she said softly. "You chose happiness." Connor nodded, feeling lighter than he ever had. He knelt down and hugged Max, who licked his face as if saying, "I knew you could do it." From that day on, Connor became fully committed to the shelter. He used his resources to expand its reach, helping animals all across the country. Rachel stood by him, not just as a partner in the shelter, but as someone who truly cared about him. Together, they created a space filled with love, hope, and wagging tails. Connor finally understood that true wealth wasn't in money or possessions. It was in the connections we build and the lives we touch. And with Rachel and Max by his side, he knew he had found the greatest treasure of all. Thank you for letting me bring this story to life. I hope it leaves a warm impression. Let me know if you'd like me to create something new.